History often celebrates the empire that marches beneath banners, annexes provinces, and carves victory into stone. But some of the most powerful civilizations in human history ruled almost nothing in the conventional sense. They mastered routes instead of continents, contracts instead of frontiers, information instead of massed armies. And for centuries, that was enough to shape the ancient world. The story of Phoenicia, and above all of Tyre, is the story of how a people too narrow in land to dominate their neighbors learned instead to dominate the links between them. It is also the story of how such power becomes visible to empires only when it is too valuable to leave alone. In the end, Tyre did not fall because commerce was weak. Tyre fell because commerce had become indispensable. To understand that paradox, the narrative must begin in the ruins of an older world. Around 1200 BC, the Late Bronze Age order across the eastern Mediterranean fractured. Great palace systems that had coordinated tribute, diplomacy, and long-distance exchange from Egypt to Anatolia and the Levant entered crisis. Some collapsed abruptly, others decayed unevenly, but the effect was the same: old certainties vanished. Long-established powers lost coherence. Trade routes became more dangerous. Regional violence intensified. But disorder is rarely pure destruction. Disorder also opens space. When vast hierarchical systems break apart, smaller actors can maneuver in the cracks. Along the Levantine coast, that space belonged to a chain of cities that modern language groups together under one label, the Phoenicians. They were not a single unified kingdom with one sovereign center. They were a constellation of city-states, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Arwood, and others, linked by language, religion, and commercial habits, yet divided by local interests, dynasties, and rivalries. Their geography imposed discipline. The Phoenician cities occupied a narrow coastal strip hemmed in by the sea to the west and mountains or stronger inland powers to the east. Their agricultural hinterlands were limited. Their manpower was finite. Their terrain offered ports, not broad imperial plains. Any dream of conquering the interior on the scale of Egypt, Assyria, or later Persia would have been fantasy. This weakness, however, became the seed of strategic innovation. Because these cities could not win through territorial mass, they learned to survive through mobility, specialization, and exchange. The Levant was rich in what the wider world desired. Cedar timber from the mountains of Lebanon was legendary, sought for shipbuilding, monumental architecture, and royal construction. Purple dye, extracted at high cost and associated with elite prestige, became one of antiquity's great symbols of status. Phoenician craftsmen excelled in luxury goods, carved ivories, metalwork, glass, and fine manufactured objects that moved through courts and sanctuaries far beyond their homeland. But commodities alone do not explain Phoenician significance. The real prize was connective power. The Mediterranean was not simply a body of water separating civilizations. It was an arena in which access, passage, relay, and trust determined who prospered. Whoever could move timber, metals, prestige goods, information, and obligations across long distances could shape the behavior of kings without necessarily sitting on their thrones. That made the Levant a geopolitical trap and an opportunity at once. Egypt, when strong, sought influence over the corridor. Assyria demanded tribute and obedience from western cities. Babylon inherited that appetite for submission. Persia later required fleets to sustain imperial war in the eastern Mediterranean. Greek powers looked for markets, metals, strategic harbors, and colonial advantage. The Phoenician cities stood at the intersection of maritime opportunity and imperial appetite. They were useful to everyone and safe from no one. This is the central paradox that governed their rise. Because they could not dominate land, they learned to dominate what land powers needed from one another. They became specialists in the architecture of interdependence. In practical terms, that meant ships, ports, brokers, treaties, tribute arrangements, diplomatic flexibility, and above all a culture organized around exchange rather than territorial absorption. By the early first millennium BC, Phoenician strategy was no longer merely local survival. It had matured into a durable system. Among the leading cities, Tyre emerged as one of the most formidable examples of how maritime commerce could be transformed into political leverage. Under rulers such as Hiram I in the 10th century BC, Tyre demonstrated that a port could become more than a marketplace. It could function as a strategic command node, a place where diplomacy, finance, shipbuilding, religion, and expansion were fused into a coherent statecraft. Hiram's era became famous in later traditions for royal diplomacy and construction partnerships, particularly with inland kingdoms. But the deeper significance lies in the model, not the anecdotes. Tyre's rulers understood that influence could be projected through controlled exchange. Timber contracts, artisan expertise, shipping capacity, and access to wider networks gave the city leverage disproportionate to its size. This was not empire in the Assyrian sense. It was administered relevance. The Phoenician maritime system expanded accordingly. Cyprus offered copper, a metal essential to the economies and technologies of the age. The central Mediterranean provided relay positions through which goods, crews, and intelligence could move in stages rather than in reckless leaps. North Africa offered room for commercial and colonial expansion. Sicily and Sardinia held strategic value because they sat astride routes and resource zones. Iberia, especially in the far west, promised silver and other metals that could enrich any power capable of extracting and transporting them. Settlements such as Gader in Iberia and, later, Carthage in North Africa were not random outposts established by adventurous merchants chasing romantic horizons. They were nodes in a distributed architecture. They stored goods, mediated local alliances, protected maritime corridors, gathered information, and reduced the risk of long-distance trade by breaking it into governable segments. Such settlements allowed a merchant civilization to function with something approaching strategic depth. A ship did not sail into emptiness. It sailed through a chain of known relationships. Here lies the true revolution of Phoenician power. Ships mattered, of course. Seamanship mattered. Colonies mattered. But the decisive achievement was the creation of administrable trust across distance. Trade on a grand scale requires more than courage at sea. It requires records, obligations, names, quantities, debts, ownership claims, and the capacity to make a promise legible in one port that can be recognized in another. In this realm, the Phoenicians possessed one of history's great advantages, a streamlined consonantal script that was far easier to use for practical commercial notation than many older and more cumbersome writing systems. This script did not emerge as a philosophical gift to humanity. It emerged from utility. Merchants needed speed. Administrators needed clarity. Transactions needed memory outside the human mind. The Phoenician writing system helped satisfy those needs. It allowed names, goods, obligations, and messages to travel with greater reliability across the maritime web. In that sense, Phoenician power was informational before it was imperial. The script was not the final alphabet used in the modern world, but it formed a crucial bridge. The Greeks adapted it. Latin would stand further downstream. Much of the written administrative and cultural architecture of later Mediterranean civilization would carry traces of a tool sharpened first for mercantile efficiency. Such achievements depended not only on technique but on political temperament. The Phoenician cities survived because they practiced flexibility with uncommon discipline. When stronger powers rose inland, they negotiated. When tribute had to be paid, tribute was paid. When imperial kings needed fleets, ships were supplied. When direct confrontation promised ruin, pride was restrained. This was realism in one of its purest historical forms. The Phoenician cities did not mistake symbolic defiance for strategy. They understood limits, and by respecting those limits they outlived many bolder regimes. But every survival technology carries hidden costs. The same adaptability that made Phoenicia indispensable also made unity elusive. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and the others did not always act in concert. Each city had its own dynasty, its own calculations, and its own thresholds of risk. A network can absorb shocks because it is decentralized. But decentralization also means that different nodes respond differently to pressure. When empires demand submission, one city may calculate that compromise preserves prosperity, while another concludes that resistance protects status. A network power is resilient until its incentives diverge. Then resilience becomes fragmentation. This tension mattered because the Eastern Mediterranean was entering an age of relentless imperial consolidation. Assyria in the 9th to 7th centuries BC drove westward with a political logic unlike that of looser earlier hegemonies. The Assyrian state sought tribute, yes, but also systematic subordination. It wanted resources, manpower, symbolic submission, and strategic access. The Phoenician cities were too useful to destroy casually and too wealthy to ignore. Therefore Assyria squeezed them. This relationship revealed the ambiguity of Phoenician success. Assyria needed maritime expertise it did not naturally possess in equal measure. Phoenician ports, artisans, and ships were assets to imperial power. But because they were assets, they became taxable, coercible, and vulnerable. The city-states survived, often prospered, and remained active in trade. But their autonomy now existed within increasingly narrow political corridors. To be useful to empire is not to be free from empire. Assyrian inscriptions and campaigns projected the usual image of irresistible royal dominance, but the deeper reality was more transactional. The empire could terrorize and demand tribute, yet it also relied upon local intermediaries. Here again the Phoenicians excelled. They navigated the imperial order without surrendering the entirety of their commercial identity. Ports continued to operate. Exchange continued. Influence persisted. But the balance was unstable. Because power inland kept consolidating, the old strategy of negotiated survival faced mounting pressure. Each imperial generation learned more clearly that controlling the network was preferable to merely taxing it. After Assyria's decline, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II inherited both the opportunities and anxieties of ruling the Levant. Babylonian power was formidable, but maritime strongholds remained difficult to neutralize by conventional land methods. Tyre in particular possessed a reputation for security. Its island position offered insulation. Its fleets connected it outward. Its wealth gave it endurance. Such cities could not simply be ridden down by cavalry in a single dramatic campaign. Therefore the contest shifted toward patience, siege, and attrition. The long siege of Tyre from 586 BC to 573 BC stands as one of the clearest stress tests of Phoenician strategy. Babylon could devastate territory and isolate access. Tyre could endure through maritime advantages and defensive position. The struggle became a contest between the staying power of a land empire and the connective resilience of a maritime node. This was not merely a military episode. It was a philosophical collision between two forms of power. Babylon represented concentrated territorial sovereignty, the logic that authority must compel submission in a bounded hierarchy. Tyre represented networked wealth, the logic that influence can persist through mobility, exchange, and adaptation. Nebuchadnezzar's siege showed that even famed commercial strongholds could be slowly strangled if a determined empire accepted delay as the price of control. Tyre survived in some form, but the lesson was ominous. Maritime insulation was no longer absolute. A city that depends on connection can be weakened by disconnection, even if its walls remain standing. Then the Persian Empire transformed the equation again. The Achaemenid system was among the greatest territorial machines the ancient world had ever seen, stretching across vast and diverse regions. But no land empire, however immense, could act effectively across the eastern Mediterranean without fleets. Persia had scale, roads, tribute systems, and armies. It needed naval capacity. The Phoenicians provided it. Under Persian rule, Phoenician fleets became the naval backbone of imperial strategy. This was in one sense the apex of Phoenician utility. Their ships, sailors, and maritime experience mattered at the highest level of world politics. They were now embedded in the military machinery of the largest empire of the age. Yet the triumph concealed a confinement. The masters of the sea were serving masters of the land. During the Greco-Persian conflicts, Phoenician naval contributions were central to imperial operations against the Greek world. This demonstrated how thoroughly their expertise had been integrated into a foreign strategic framework. It also revealed the narrowing margin of independent action. To be indispensable is to be drawn ever deeper into the objectives of stronger patrons. Persia did not need to erase Phoenician cities to subordinate them. It only needed to make their prosperity conditional on imperial service. This is one of history's recurring patterns. Network powers often flourish most visibly when attached to larger coercive structures, but that prosperity can disguise the erosion of sovereign choice. Even then, the old Phoenician system retained remarkable vitality. Trade did not stop. Cultural continuity persisted. Western settlements, especially Carthage, grew in significance. The network still functioned. But the strategic environment was changing in a more radical way than many contemporaries could fully grasp. The older formula of coastal resilience, diplomatic pliability, and maritime wealth had worked because even great empires had generally respected certain practical limits. Island cities were difficult. Fleets required specialists. Distance imposed friction. Therefore nodes such as Tyre could endure. But history does not preserve formulas forever. It waits for a conqueror willing to change the rules. That conqueror arrived in 332 BC. Alexander of Macedon advanced through the eastern Mediterranean not merely as a battlefield prodigy but as a strategist determined to deny his enemies any residual base of resistance. After victories against Persia, the Phoenician cities faced a decision that had confronted their predecessors many times: accommodate the new hegemon or resist. Many submitted. Tyre did not accept the terms in full. The issue was not simply ritual access or wounded pride, though symbolic questions mattered in ancient politics. The issue was control. Tyre still embodied the old confidence of a maritime stronghold. Its island position had protected it for generations. Its reputation, wealth, and naval tradition suggested that even Alexander might be checked or delayed into compromise. This was a rational calculation by the standards of the past. But it was made inside a world that no longer existed. Alexander refused the traditional terms of the contest. He would not leave an unconquered commercial node astride his line of advance. He would not tolerate the possibility that Persian naval resistance or anti-Macedonian forces might regroup through Tyrian resources. Therefore he committed to the unthinkable solution: if the sea protected Tyre, the land would be extended into the sea. The causeway built toward the island was more than an engineering project. It was a declaration that geography itself would no longer set the final terms of politics. Alexander was announcing that Imperial will, organized with sufficient ruthlessness and ingenuity, could erase the very advantages on which older powers had relied. The siege became one of antiquity's great demonstrations of persistence, adaptation, and total commitment. Tyre resisted fiercely. The city's defenders exploited their naval experience and fortifications. The sea, once the city's strategic ally, still complicated every assault. But Alexander escalated. He brought in fleets. He expanded the mole. He turned the siege into a combined operation of engineering and attrition. In strategic terms, this was the fatal inversion of Tyre's historical model. The city had always depended on superior connectivity and insulation from direct land coercion. Alexander systematically dismantled both. He denied insulation by physically bridging the gap. He undermined connectivity by bringing overwhelming force and alliance networks to bear. Tyre was not simply attacked. Tyre was conceptually outflanked. When the city finally fell in 332 BC, the event carried significance far beyond the immediate bloodshed and destruction. The fall of Tyre marked the shattering of an ancient assumption, that a sufficiently wealthy and well-connected maritime city could remain beyond the full reach of territorial empire if it managed diplomacy carefully enough. Alexander proved otherwise. He did not merely capture a city. He demonstrated that a conqueror willing to expend enough labor, time, and violence could absorb even the most formidable network stronghold into a larger imperial design. In that moment, an era ended. The shockwaves were immediate. Phoenician independence in the eastern Mediterranean was broken beyond meaningful recovery. Trade routes did not vanish, but they were increasingly reorganized within Hellenistic frameworks. The old city-state system survived in forms, customs, and local continuities, yet its strategic autonomy had been decisively compromised. More importantly, the energy of the broader Phoenician world shifted westward. Carthage, the great western heir, inherited more of the old system's ambition, memory, and burden. When the eastern network was subordinated, the western network became the principal carrier of Phoenician logic. Carthage is therefore not a footnote to the story but its afterlife. Founded as a Phoenician colony, it grew into a major Mediterranean power in its own right. In Carthage, the commercial habits, maritime instincts, and colonial architecture of the Phoenician world were enlarged and militarized for a new age. What Tyre had pioneered as a network civilization, Carthage would transform into a great state capable of contesting entire regions. Yet even that inheritance confirms the darker law of the Phoenician experience. Carthage thrived because it mastered routes, resources, alliances, and exchange across the western Mediterranean. But that very success placed it in collision with another expanding territorial power learning how to capture systems rather than merely trade through them, Rome. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC would become the western echo of Tyre's fate. The network survived by adaptation, but wherever it became essential, rising empires eventually moved to seize or destroy it. This is why the deepest legacy of Phoenicia is not reducible to ships or colonies alone. It is informational. The Phoenician script, adapted by the Greeks and transmitted through later alphabets, helped shape the written systems that would support law, commerce, administration, religion, and cultural memory across much of the Mediterranean and later Europe. One of history's most enduring revolutions began not in a philosopher's academy or a conquering palace but in the practical needs of merchants moving obligations across distance. Here the Phoenicians reveal something profound about civilization itself. Monumental empires often dominate historical memory because they leave palaces, inscriptions, conquest narratives, and imperial iconography. They appear grander because they are designed to appear grand. But network powers shape the hidden grammar of society. They determine how goods move, how information travels, how contracts are trusted, how elites communicate, and how distant regions become mutually legible. They may leave fewer triumphal myths, yet they quietly define the operating system of an age. This makes their story both subtler and, in many ways, more modern. The Phoenicians did not need to rule every shore they touched. They needed to make themselves difficult to bypass. Their genius lay in understanding that power can be exercised through intermediation. A city or people that sits at the hinge points of exchange can influence empires larger than itself. It can shape choices upstream and downstream. It can prosper through relevance rather than territorial size. But therein lies the danger. Once a network becomes essential, stronger states stop tolerating it as a neutral intermediary. They begin to study it, tax it, pressure it, and eventually absorb it. Usefulness is admired only until it can be captured. The verdict, then, is severe. The Phoenicians built one of the ancient world's most effective systems of distributed power. They linked timber, metals, dyes, luxury goods, ships, harbors, records, and trust into a civilizational web stretching across the Mediterranean. They proved that small states, if strategically lucid, can shape history far beyond the limits of their farmland or armies. They also revealed the limit of that model. A network can flourish in the space between empires. It can even make empires dependent upon it. But if no overriding political unity protects that network, its very success invites conquest by powers that prefer possession to partnership. Tyre fell because the world it had mastered taught larger empires what was worth taking. The modern mirror is impossible to ignore. In every age, there are societies, institutions, and systems that appear less dramatic than armies and flags but exercise enormous influence by organizing connection itself, trade routes, communication channels, financial ledgers, logistical platforms, information standards. They often present themselves as facilitators rather than rulers. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is merely a gentler vocabulary for power. But the Phoenician precedent warns that the organizer of the network lives under a permanent strategic shadow. The more essential the system becomes, the more irresistible it appears to states and rival powers determined to control the terms of dependence. Human nature has not changed as much as technology suggests. The builders of indispensable systems still discover that excellence is a magnet for predation. There is, finally, a deeper reflection on the human condition. History often flatters conquest because conquest is visible. It can be mapped. It can be narrated in campaigns and coronations. But much of civilization is built by quieter forms of mastery, standardizing exchange, preserving memory, simplifying communication, extending trust beyond kinship, and transforming distance from a barrier into a structure of opportunity. The Phoenicians excelled at this civilizational craftsmanship. Yet the tragedy of such achievement is that it rarely remains politically innocent. Once the channels of power are built, others seek to militarize them. Once information flows efficiently, others seek to monopolize it. Once the sea becomes a highway of wealth, others seek to fortify its exits and entrances. The makers of the system become the first targets of those who would own the system entire. That is the enduring lesson of Tyre. Not that commerce is weak, nor that small states are doomed, but that every network creates a new map of power, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a conqueror is studying that map. The legacy question remains unsettling precisely because no archive can answer it in full. When a civilization becomes most influential through the systems it builds rather than the territory it holds, is its highest achievement also the blueprint of its eventual subjugation?